During this period in the U.S., the CIA and the military were researching new interrogation techniques, concentrating on psychological methods. Experiments included the use of drugs, though the results were never as good as people had envisioned.
The trouble with using drugs is that oftentimes your subject certainly will yield information, but it may be a half-truth, it may be hallucinated, it may not be totally on the mark because he's so disoriented. Drugs really don't work unless you're looking for a very specific kind of information, the name of a spy, the name of a colleague. But if you want somebody to discuss strategic intelligence, what the adversary is going to do next, or what the terrorist cell is going to do next, you're not going to get it.
In the desperate battle to uncover information on the enemy, both the North and South Vietnamese forces used brutal methods. So did the Americans, for the most part indirectly.
Oftentimes the Americans would threaten, for instance, to turn a Viet Cong cadre over to our South Vietnamese allies and close our eyes and turn our backs, knowing that the communists would think, well, I'm going to be tortured. And in fact, that would happen. The Americans didn't need to do their torturing. They didn't need to use strong-arm tactics because we could rely on our allies to put the fear of God into our adversaries.
The surprise attack by the North Vietnamese during the Tet Offensive exposed America's lack of detailed intelligence about the enemy. Subsequently, intense pressure was put upon interrogators to extract better, or at least more, information from prisoners. And there weren't enough trained interrogators available.
Oftentimes, because we were using not experts to do the interrogations in the field, but people seconded from the U.S. military, we would use the worst kind of tactics. They would be beaten up, they would be tormented. Well, if you put somebody under that kind of pressure, what he's going to tell you is whatever will relieve the pain. And it's never strategic intelligence. It can often be terribly inaccurate. And as time went on, we began to discover that many of the reports that had been generated during that post-Tet period were inaccurate.
As a young interrogator in Vietnam, Frank Snepp realized that a focused psychological approach would probably work best. When he interrogated Non Van Thai, America's most important prisoner, Snepp skillfully used his knowledge of Vietnamese cultural beliefs to weaken the prisoner's resolve.
Do you hear me? Who is your next of kin? What about your father?
He was immediately placed in solitary confinement in a snow-white room. We over-refrigerated the room. We had too much air conditioning because we knew that the Vietnamese believed that when exposed to cold air, their veins would shrink up.
Snepp played on the fact that he was younger than Van Thai.
There is a great sense of hierarchy in the Vietnamese culture. Why was this kid, which I was in those days, put up against Nguyen Van Thai? Because we knew that he would feel insulted to have such a junior character, me, dealing with him. And he would rage. He would be contemptuous. He would refuse to believe that I might be one step ahead of him. Then when I managed to be, his vanity would come into play and he would shout. He would give out more than he meant to.
Snepp also exploited a secret he knew about the prisoner's past.
I knew that he had betrayed his father on the way up the party ladder, and I used it with him.
Tell me your father's name. You're too ashamed to tell me your father's name?
You venerate old age, but if I, as the young interrogator, do not venerate old age, if I don't venerate the senior cadre, if I say, you know something, you betrayed your father. How could you do that in your culture? I don't know anything about your culture, but I do know that's wrong. And do it enough, and he begins to break down.
Information from other prisoners played a big part in the interrogation, pitting one comrade against another.
I was interrogating at one point, when I had him under my lens, 8 other communist cadre, many of them from the same territory, from the same political elements. And so I would go into one interrogation, pick up a little bit here, take it into his interrogation, play it back to him, lead him to believe that one of his colleagues, one of his comrades was giving away much more than he actually was. That was a major element in my approach to this guy.
Snepp eventually broke Nguyen Van Thai, and the communist gave up accurate information about North Vietnamese operations in and around Saigon. The techniques he used, a mixture of sensory deprivation, psychological ploys, and playing one prisoner off against another, are now standard interrogation practices. On the 11th of September, a whole new battlefield was created, with a new kind of enemy. Interrogation was once again to become a major weapon in the war against terror.
Post 9/11, we've discovered that interrogation is absolutely key. It's a key element in the intelligence gathering process. We have yet to develop really good penetration networks inside the terrorist cells. So when you nab a top-ranking terrorist, number 2 and number 3 in Al-Qaeda, you've got to immediately begin applying interrogation technique.
This is the notorious Camp X-Ray, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Hundreds of Islamic fighters from the war in Afghanistan are being interrogated here, held in small cells with little or no exercise, and subjected to the full array of interrogation techniques.
Sensory deprivation is one of the favorites today. Putting somebody in a snow-white room, turning on the lights, turning up the air conditioning, serving his meals at different times, insulting him. We're going back to techniques that were really perfected in the CIA during the Vietnam years, and that is subtle dialogue, total knowledge of the adversary, and poking holes in his vanity.
Another technique is to undermine a prisoner's cultural beliefs.
If you know that as an Islamic fundamentalist he looks down on women, you bring in a woman and you not only expose him to interrogation by a woman, but she knows to go for his manhood, to go for his sense of self as it is embodied in his belief system. She said, "Oh, aren't you ridiculous? Aren't you ridiculous?" Or she can sympathize and say, "See, I'm not so bad after all." He's so busy trying to hold off the stereotype that he doesn't see the lioness coming at him. If we're dealing with a tough prisoner, we say, "Look, we'll turn you over to the Israelis. We'll lose you to the Egyptians." And that's enough in some cases to turn the tables and to change an attitude. So what we're doing today, I think, is updating a lot of old techniques, but we have a lot of bad cops to play into the scenario now.
As we have seen, in times of extreme political crisis, governments and armies of all political persuasion have been prepared to use brutal methods in the quest for information. But is the information we get that way really worth the price?
The strong-arm tactics can